Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Q&A on the spiritual life with Jean Corrie. Jean, in the last video, we talked about the seemingly at odds concept of what the church teaches, that everyone is called to holiness, and St. Paul's uh, uh, teaching in the first letters to the Corinthians, chapter 7, that talked about how if a man is single, he's better off single. This way he can take care of the things of the Lord, because a married man would be more concerned with things of how to please his wife and so on. And you explained to us that it is more related to at what point in one's life do we hear the calling. Did we hear the calling before we got married? Then it might be better to stay in that state and not get married. But if we hear the call after we're married, then we obviously stay married. So one example that comes to my mind is Saint Teresa's parents, who have both been canonized. They both were married, obviously. Um, they weren't a classic case where they separated and became religious. We see throughout the history of the church that a lot of the saints that were married, they either became widows or became religious, and that was not the case with them. So tell us about how can they be considered saints within the sacrament, within the context of marriage? How did they answer this calling of Jesus to the heights of holiness, having already been married?
Yes. Hi, Camila, and hi, everybody, and thank you for your question here about sanctity and marriage. Of course, you picked up I would say the ideal case of marriage, which is a little bit even an extreme case. Because I don't know if everybody knows, we are talking about the Saint Therese of Lisieux's parents, Louis and Zélie Martin. They've been canonized in 2015. And in their case, they both felt a call for religious life. So they both presented themselves to monastic life and religious life, and they weren't accepted. And then they met and married. Not only that, but they thought that they were doing the right thing by not having any intimate relationship. No sexuality, no. They thought they were doing this. They made like a vow to live like virgins, if you want. When the confessor or spiritual director discovered that, of course, he said that that's not the right thing to do. Marriage is meant to create a family. Of course, it's always a grace, because sometimes people marry and then they can't have children because they can't, and it's painful. It's very painful. But in their case, it was a choice not to have any relationship to give children. So he said, no, you have to have children, and they worked on it very well. No, they had, I don't remember now, 8 or 9. 3, I think, of them haven't survived or lived very little, and then we have the whole family, Agnès, Léonie, Pauline, Agnès, Léonie, Pauline, Thérèse, and Céline, 5. Now, your question is holiness, and by the way, Madame Martin, Zélie, dies when Thérèse is still very young.
In marriage.
So you mentioned being a widow. In our case, Monsieur Martin becomes widow quite early. He has to carry on alone, and he carried alone. He didn't marry. He could have married, because whenever your husband or wife die, you're free to marry if you feel. No, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you here, Jean, but I just want to emphasize what you're saying is that they both had heard the call before marriage. So one would have advised perhaps stay unmarried, maybe I don't know. So their case is really extreme.
Absolutely, I agree. At least this is how it looks to us. It is extreme, um, yes, and we see the fruits of that extreme case. I'm sure all the family could, to a certain extent, be canonized. But of course, I am more on the side of saying Therese is a unique case. Of course, she wouldn't be there if her parents weren't holy. Therese is
Right.
influenced enormously in her childhood by the holiness of her parents. They were talking about heaven all the time, to the point that Therese was saying she was still very young, you know, she could not understand everything. So heaven meant they taught to be with Jesus, to see God, etc. So Therese was begging her mom, when will you die? Which means you need to go and see Jesus. Of course, she didn't understand, but sadly, Madame Martin died as well a few years after. No,
Yeah.
so. It's a holy family, very holy family, very rare case where both are called, both have this second conversion, and despite that they're not following St. Paul, or if you want, they followed St. Paul, but they have been rejected. They understood
Mhm.
that God's will was to create a holy family, which in the end of the day, that's the ideal sacrament. If you are a priest, that's the best couple you would marry in your life, no? Because from day one, they are fully for it, to the point that they didn't even have any sexual relationship for a while, thinking that that was God's will, no? So yes, we are in front of an extreme case. We are in front of a very holy life, grounded. They both worked very hard. We're not dealing with a strange family. We're dealing with a normal family, hardworking, but as well taking care of their children, educating their children, and dealing with difficulties. I mean, if you see even Therese herself, who is a great saint, I mean, the greatest saint of modern times, according to Pope Pius the 11th. Now, this could be, of course, challenged and discussed by many people, but I still stick to that, no? So even Therese herself, in her youth, she went through a very difficult crisis, scruples crisis, and it's by the intervention of Our Lady that she was healed. So, you know, you live your life, you have struggles, you lose your job, you lose your mind in the end. Monsieur Martin has a sort of a dementia toward the end of his life. So it's holiness doesn't mean you want to have the daily difficulties, but this is how they lived it. Now, to go into details, you know, it's a prayer for, they prayed, they were very faithful to the mass, etc. But in the end, I think the core of it is what Therese received as well. I think it's this life of a truly understanding of sacrifice. I think it's a word we don't use anymore, sadly, in the church. But I think the key to understand Therese is a correct understanding of sacrifice, which is not just like killing yourself, etc., but sacrifice in the good sense, understanding that God is asking you something, so you willingly and happily offer it. You don't lose, but you gain.
Mhm.
You might be losing something, but you gain. And this is a key in Saint Therese, but I think that it is very well grounded in her family. And even after the death of or while she was alive, she had her sisters taking care of her. And you know, there are plenty of stories she's telling, Therese telling, but they come from her family. They say, okay, would you do this sacrifice for Jesus? No, would you not eat this cookie for Jesus. So Therese, she was very young. Imagine. This is almost like built in you, no? Um, so Therese struggles and says, okay, yes, I will give it to Jesus. Then the sister says, okay, now you have it. So Therese is shocked. It's like, but earlier on you said that I need to offer I will lose then the merit of the sacrifice. He says, no, your merit now is bigger because of obedience. So these notions that are very alien to the majority of the families, the difference between what is the sacrifice, what is obedience, what is this, it's like we don't know. We have no knowledge of that. Where daily life in this family. So you took the ideal case that produced the ideal saint. Not all of them, I would say, have the same sanctity. Therese is a genius. I would still think that we have to consider her as a part, holiness that is like almost sent by God. There is something that is unique to her. We can talk about Therese another day. So I'm afraid the choice is like almost too high to be considered. Now for poor married people, it's like what are we supposed to do? We are not as holy as Monsieur Martin or his wife Zélie Martin. So what are we supposed to do? I think we need all to focus on the call, to try to hear Jesus' voice calling us, because the key to understand all this is a call. They had the call, and do we have the call? You wanted to talk to married people, so to married people, do you hear the call? We have the call, yes, but do you hear the call? Which is more important? Are you aware of it? Are you trying to experience the grace of God? Do you start to have a personal relationship with Jesus that is growing? Is your life slowly changing? And it comes with all the challenges.
Yeah, I think the question, it begs the question to say how, and we could do another video on this, is okay, so yes, Zélie and Louis were canonized. Yes, they were very prayerful, but so far we haven't. There are many pious families that are prayerful and go to mass, and um, the question that is coming to me that I have is, did they reach the heights of contemplation? Did they reach that spiritual marriage that we talk about? Is there a different kind of holiness that is not quite Saint Therese kind of holiness, but is still, you still get into heaven, but you're not Saint Therese? I mean, but in spite of being married, is it a second best, or is it something that, no, it's the same holiness, just that they were able to find it within the sacrament of marriage? And if so, how?
Thank you for your question. There are degrees in holiness. Plus, I'm not an expert in their life, and Zélie and Louis Martin, but still, we can have some answers to your question. First and foremost, you mentioned contemplation. What is contemplation? I mean, in daily life. Therese herself says something very interesting about contemplation. She says, when I was young, I used to sit in the back of my bed, cover myself, and think, and have deep thoughts. And she says something very interesting many years after. She says, I didn't know that was contemplation. So you have cases where people are in contemplation, but the awareness that I am in contemplation is something different. And Saint Teresa of Avila gives a beautiful example in the Way of Perfection. Now, when she mentions a nun who heard about contemplation and was very eager, a nun of a certain age, with experience, but eager to question Teresa of Avila and say, oh, I would like to have this contemplation, but I don't have it. I do only vocal prayers. So poor me, you are very high above, and so Saint Teresa of Avila doesn't surrender to that and listens carefully and discovers that this nun has contemplation and is very advanced. So having contemplation and being aware that this is contemplation are two different issues. So they certainly lived with God and had contemplation like any saint would have had, but the awareness of it, describing it, going into certain details, we might not have enough information to know it, because something is to declare somebody saint, and to have all the details of their life is something completely different. We don't have all the details. We have some details that are useful for the declaration of for the canonization, but details of the journey itself, full details, no, not all the saints. We have all the information. Like the case of Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus, we have enough information about her life, even compared to any other saint probably in the history of the Church. Well, excluding the more recent ones where we could have information. She's the most documented saint, Saint Teresa of the Child Jesus. So yes, they certainly reached these levels. I insist a lot on saying the notion, the obscure in the sense of a daily routine, implementation of a life of sacrifice. And you said there are many who live that life. Well, there are many saints who are not canonized. Thank God. Thank God, not all the saints are canonized. There are many married people who are certainly above many saints that we know. Saint Augustine himself, preaching, points out to a lady of a certain age and says, this widow there knows more than I do.
Right.
So you need to be careful, qualifying, knowing, becoming aware. I remember my master, Father Louis Guillet, a French Carmelite who died in 92, used to say, be careful. You might have a nun in front of you who doesn't know that she's there yet, that she's there. And she's not supposed to know. Only the spiritual director is supposed to sort of know. But the nun herself, it's not a necessary, always a necessary knowledge. No, you have people who are genuine and reach heights of holiness, but that's it. It's enjoyable for God. Why do you want the person to enter in? Do I know? I don't know. I'm there. I'm there. Not. She's doing it. She's already doing it. Why do you want more? Everybody's happy. You see what I'm saying? So we need to be careful when we talk about holiness. And I'm with you. I think you mentioned that before the video. We need to have more examples of saints, of married people. We need to have more practical examples in order to feel that, yes, really, this is possible. I do agree with you. That's a great need, because you can't say on one hand everybody is called to holiness. You can't say that married couple are called to holiness, and in the end of the day, how many examples do we have of married people? How much knowledge, which is a bit your question, no? How much knowledge on the practical side of it? How do you live the sacrament? What happens? Exactly. How do you deal with the struggles? Do you deal differently? How will this happen? You see what I'm trying to say? So yes, Jesus is present. We need more saints. Jesus is present in their life, etc.
Yeah, I would agree with you. We do need more saints. Sorry, but we're at 16 minutes. Jean, it's always a joy talking to you, and thank you again so much for answering my questions, my million questions. Thanks everyone for joining us in today's Q&A on the spiritual life with Jean Coury.
Thank you, everybody, and see you next time.